Falun Gong seems to be treated by the Chinese Communist Party in a very unique way. Obviously, the Communist Party cracks down on... Well, there's really no group that I can leave out of that. They crack down on everyone. But they view Falun Gong as such a unique threat, almost an existential threat to the Communist Party's existence. And I think you're touching a bit on why that is, just because of the way Falun Gong practitioners in China and abroad are so active at exposing the Communist Party.
That's right. Let me give you a couple of examples to elaborate on what you just said, because I think for your viewers, they might not know the extent of how Falun Gong is unique in that way. So in 1990, just a couple of examples. In 1999, when Jiang Zemin met President Bill Clinton, right? This is the last meeting of these two leaders before Jiang Zemin left office and Bill Clinton left office. It's at the APEC meeting. The most important top agenda item, what is it? Jiang Zemin pulls out a whole bunch of propaganda material on Falun Gong and hands it to Bill Clinton. That's his number one objective.
Wait, more important than getting into the World Trade Organization?
More important than anything at that point. At that point.
So to give propaganda to the U.S. president.
Yeah, I mean, this was in 1999, so things were moving along on the trade front, but still, a meeting between those two leaders, that became the most important thing. 2 years later, Condoleezza Rice has just taken over as National Security Advisor for President Bush. She's settling into her office. It's like day 2, day 3 of her position. She meets with the corresponding high-level Chinese officials. They come into her office. You think they're going to talk about the Taiwan Strait and all these other Hong Kong and all these other issues.
The spy plane that was shot down.
The spy plane. They pull out of their briefcase a prepared statement on Falun Gong and proceed to read it for 20 minutes. She got so fed up, she had to kick him out of the office.
Wow.
Mayors, congressmen constantly get letters from the Chinese consulate condemning Falun Gong, making sure they don't issue proclamations in support of Falun Gong. My father is a professor at a university here in America. His colleague, who happens to be Chinese but has lived here for 40 years, out of the blue gets a letter from the consulate in LA, we live in the Southwest, talking about Falun Gong and dangerous and don't talk to people. He has nothing to do with Falun Gong. He is the closest connection he has is he happens to be a colleague of my father, and I'm with the Fallon Дафа Information Center. So this is the level. Oh, sorry, one other example. A defector in Australia had from the Chinese government he had defected in Australia, and he came and testified in Washington, D.C., and he disclosed that every single diplomatic mission around the world has a department within the mission dedicated to suppressing and marginalizing Falun Gong in their country. So when we talk about does the Chinese Communist Party treat Falun Gong different or uniquely, this is what we're talking about. It is a number one priority for them, and this is the extent and the length they'll go to suppress it around the world. So I just wanted to so people had a sense of what we're really talking about.
I didn't know any of that, actually.
So back to your question, why? Mm-hmm. What makes it different? Or why don't they treat Hong Kong or Taiwanese or the Uyghurs? Now, certainly... I
mean, they treat the Uyghurs pretty badly.
They treat all those people badly, yeah. and they get pressure everywhere. You know, Taiwan gets pressure all over the place, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs. What's unique about Falun Gong as a threat is that I think one is the numbers. People forget that there were 70 to 100 million people practicing Falun Gong in 1999. Just a few years ago, we did an audit of the people who are actively doing peaceful civil disobedience in China. The number was 20 to 40 million. Actively involved.
You mean like now?
Now, inside China. And those are people who are actively doing civil disobedience type activity in the country.
So that's greater than the number of Uyghurs, Tibetans, and Hong Kong residents combined.
So is this civil disobedience related to Falun Gong specifically? This is what you're talking about?
Very specific. It's Falun Gong people themselves doing civil disobedience activities specific to Falun Gong, primarily running massive amounts of underground print shops where they deliver VCDs or flyers in their neighborhoods or the nearby villages, telling them what's really going on, because you're not going to get the real story in the CCP state-run media.
Wow, that's amazing. They're still using VCDs.
Yeah. And they still work.
But hold on a second. So there's a lot of people I've heard say, oh, well, Falun Gong, there were a lot of people in the 90s, 70 million, 100 million, but there's very few now because you don't hear anything about it, right? But you're saying that Falun Gong far from being gone is actually, you said 20 to 25 million.
20 to 40
20 to
million.
40 million who are actively involved in this kind of anti-propaganda work.
Exactly.
And then on top of that, there might even be other people who just practice the exercises, right?
Absolutely.
So that blows my mind that there's still so many people in China who practice despite 20 years of
despite organ harvesting,
being thrown in labor camps,
torture, rape.
And then also just the whole pressure to, people, the Communist Party, just wrecks people's businesses and their livelihood, gets them fired from their jobs. Like you can barely make a living once the Communist Party goes after you. And yet that many people,
20 to 40 million. Wow.
And it's, to some extent, it's not an accident. It was very much a propaganda move. I mean, if you go back and look at like Associated Press and New York Times articles from around April of 1999, they'll just repeat the government's figure. There's 70 million people practicing, right? Mm-hmm. Fast forward just a few months, and the Chinese government spokesperson has now changed that number to 3 million or 1 million. And unfortunately, without batting an eye, without asking any questions, the Associated Press, New York Times, all these media just sort of picked up that number. So suddenly, what was 70 to 100 million dropped to 1 or 3 in the press. And from there, they push that out for obvious reasons. They don't want people to understand that this is an enormous segment of Chinese society that they're going after.
But they gave a precise figure, so I believed it.
Yeah.
Well, I definitely want to talk about, like, this story is incredible, and you hardly ever hear about it in the media. I do want to talk about sort of the media's response, the Western media's response to Falun Gong. But right now, I want to get back to the topic of why the CCP views Falun Gong as such a particular threat, and the fact that there's still 20 to 40 million people inside of China doing this.
Well, I mean, doing the civil disobedience part.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, I think when we interviewed Chen Guangchen like a couple of years ago, and he was talking about how you can't know what people in China think about the Chinese Communist Party from the internet because they just know everything's watched.
This is the blind lawyer who's in DC.
Yeah, so just like...
He was telling you that he had phone calls with people, right?
Well, that he has basically connections with kind of the dissident network in China, and that there's a lot more kind of discontent with the Chinese Communist Party than we commonly think of in the West, because we just see these sanitized, internet comments or whatever.
Or the Han nationalism.
Yeah. So I just wonder if like this civil disobedience thing is the reason or part of the reason that this is a problem for the Chinese Communist Party, because if you have people who are actively kind of organizing even on small scales, even in their local communities to counter the Communist Party's message, like that seems pretty dangerous for them.
I think it's half of the answer is inside China and what they're doing. So why? Inside China, again, 20 to 40 million people essentially printing out information and delivering it door to door, stuff that counters the state-run propaganda, not just about what they're doing to Falun Gong. That's primarily the topic. But I think what practitioners in China understood early on is that the CCP had such a monopoly on people's minds that they had to, if they're going to help them understand the atrocities that Falun Gong was facing in their own backyards, they first had to unlock that grip that the CCP had on them. And so what's in that material is not just the persecution of Falun Gong, it's also the real history of the Chinese Communist Party, which is something that no people in China going through the education system would have learned. And I think that constitutes half of the answer to your question, is that Falun Gong is now the leading voice inside China that's telling the true history of all the crimes the Chinese Communist Party has committed since they came to power in 1949, and that scares the bejesus out of them.
That's really interesting because this July 1st is the 100-year anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party, and there is a big push. They've created hotlines so people can report anyone who's making illegal comments about the history of the Chinese Communist Party.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I think that was huge, because now suddenly a populace of 4 million, 5 million, billion at this point, where they had been able to control the narrative, now on every doorstep at some point over the course of a year or 2 or 3 years, all those people are getting information about what the Chinese Communist Party really did when it came to power, all the people it killed and the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and what really went down. all that stuff is being revealed. So that's I think that's half of your answer. The other half to the answer is what Falun Gong has been doing internationally. If you look at the community in the West, there has been an enormous effort, almost entirely volunteer-based, but an enormous effort in the area of human rights organizations. And this is something to note, is that China, trying to get human rights reports out of China and authenticated is extremely difficult. If you look at Amnesty International or these groups, they do a great job, but their hands are tied. It's not like they have an office in Beijing and they've got people to go out. They've got officially nobody inside China. Falun Gong and the network that we run, we have an enormous network in every single city, town, and village across China. So if someone gets tortured to death in a labor camp or someone's wife is taken away and put in prison, we know about it. The international community knows about it. We are now the network, the single greatest network to get information out of China. And that's why, for example, when the pandemic first went down, you saw an enormous spike in the number of Falun Gong practitioners being pulled off the streets and into detention. Why? Because they were the ones who were going to first get out what was really happening around Wuhan. The same thing happened with SARS. Over the Falun Gong network, we heard months before SARS broke on the international stage. We heard months before that in our sort of network about this mystery illness that was striking people. So Falun Gong has become a megaphone for all the dirty laundry that CCP is doing in China internationally. And, on the human rights front, but also organizing media companies. There's been even cultural institutions. There's been a real sort of renaissance of traditional Chinese culture, but also reporting on human rights within the Falun Gong community outside China. And that's the second half, I think, in answer to your question, is they're scared of that.